Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Sheffrin. I'm the Executive Director of the Murphy Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today for the Yates Lecture. The Mary C. Parker Yates Lecture was endowed in 1996 by Murphy Institute alumna Rebecca Yates Philander in memory of her mother. It's designed to promote university-wide discussions of issues of current concern and to bring leading thinkers to the Tulane campus. Let me at this point also thank Professor James Ahm in economics for helping to arrange today's lecture. It's with great pleasure today to introduce this year's late Yates Lecture, Dr. Arthur C. Brooks. Arthur Brooks is the president of the American Enterprise Institute, leading a distinctive and highly influential Washington think tank now in its 75th year, and in fact celebrating this year's 75th anniversary. He's also the Beth and Ravenel Curry Scholar in Free Enterprise at the Institute. Dr. Brooks is the author of 10 books and hundreds of articles on topics ranging from the roles of government in the private sector, charitable contributions, fairness, economic opportunity, and the morality of free enterprise. His most recent book, The Road to Freedom, How to Win the Fight for Free Enterprise, was a New York Times bestseller. Earlier books included Gross National Happiness, Social Entrepreneurship, and a book called Who Really Cares? Prior to joining the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Brooks held an endowed chair at Syracuse University and wrote extensively on social entrepreneurship, philanthropy, and the culture of free enterprise. Before joining the faculty at Syracuse, he was at Georgia State, where he was a colleague of Professor Ahm. He holds a doctorate in policy analysis from the Rand Graduate School. Now, I first became aware of Dr. Brooks through his op-ed pieces in the Wall Street Journal. The first one I recall reading, probably a number of years ago, was a beautifully written and disarming piece that punctured the conventional wisdom on the relationship between party affiliation and charitable contributions. He has also written persuasively on the important role the non-governmental sector plays in pursuing broadly socially held goals. Now, Dr. Brooks did not follow the typical linear path to his great success today. He started as an accomplished classical musician playing in Europe and the United States, and actually held a professorship in the French horn, before embarking on his career as a policy analyst and academic. In an article in the New York Times last January, he also discussed how he earned what he termed a 10K BA degree, after returning from Europe through a correspondence course organized through Thomas Edison State College in Trenton, New Jersey. This is a great American story of opportunity taken, a very important lesson for everyone. Now, in the article, Dr. Brooks mentions that there was no residency requirement at Thomas Edison State College, and at that point he had yet to visit the school or even laid eyes on the school. As a native of Trenton, I felt that was terrible that he hadn't seen it. But he told me just in conversation just before today that just a few weeks ago he was in Trenton, and then we reminisced about what an old city it was. Today, Dr. Brooks will discuss one of his research themes in his talk, The Secrets of Happiness. After his address, we'll have time for questions and answers, and then a reception will follow right next door. So please join me today in welcoming Dr. Arthur C. Brooks.
Thank you, Steve. It's an honor to be here. It's great to see my old friend Jim Ahm. We started together at Georgia State University in Atlanta at the very beginning of my academic career, and he kept his hair. I didn't keep mine, but such is life. I'm the president of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. Some of you have heard of it, maybe some of you haven't. We do work on economics, we do work on foreign policy, we do work on public policy, and we work a lot with policymakers. And that's what I've been interested in most of my career. I'm an economist, and early on in my career, I taught at Syracuse for a long time. I was at Syracuse for about 7 years before I came to Washington, D.C. And I remember one day I was out for lunch with a friend of mine who was a psychologist, a social psychology professor, and I was complaining about my work. And he said, what's the matter? I said, I'm writing a paper, and it really isn't coming out the way I want it to. It's not describing the way people really behave very well. And he said, that's always the same with you guys, with you economists. He said, the problem with people like you? And nothing good ever comes after somebody says, the problem with people like you. And he said, you guys have no idea what motivates people. You have no idea. And I said, well, humoring him, I said, what motivates people? He said, not money, happiness. I said, Okay. He said, why don't you write about happiness? I mean, really? I mean, there's data on it. And I said, really? He says, yeah, there's data on happiness. And he said, what would hold you back? And I realized there was nothing holding me back. I had tenure. I was a full professor. I mean, there's a tenured full professor is having no adult supervision whatsoever in life. I mean, you can kill somebody and it's okay. Basically, you won't lose your job. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to start writing about happiness. So I took 2 years and I did a study of happiness, and I came up with a lot of findings I'm going to talk about tonight, and I'm going to relate them to what's going on in Washington, D.C. today, and maybe some things that are going on in your lives as well. If I do my job in the next half hour, I'm going to give you some of the secrets to leading a happier life. I'm going to tell you some things that have not just changed my research, they've actually changed the way I live my life. And I'm going to submit them to you for your consideration. So when you do work on the science of happiness, the first thing you ask is, who's happy? Right? Now, economists and psychologists have been asking that question now for 40 years. There's a big literature on this. And they'll ask typically questions like this. You don't want to know, how happy are you in this moment? Nobody cares. I mean, then you go up and you go down and you're all over the place. It's not interesting. It doesn't tell you very much. Usually you'll ask questions like this. People have ups and downs in their lives. Everybody knows that. But all things considered, how happy would you say you are at this point in your life? Okay, now, it's very robust, and there's a lot of research that shows that that's a pretty good way to ask the question. They'll say, on a scale of 1 to 7, okay, where 1 is abject misery and 7 is complete bliss, what's your number? Okay, now, if you ask this to a large group of people anonymously, and you ask them over and over in slightly different ways, it turns out, according to the literature, you get some pretty good data. You get some pretty good evidence of actually who's happy and who's not. So think about it. What's your number? You've got the number in your head. How many of you is a 6 or a 7? Really happy, okay? We're on a college campus, so that's like nobody's putting their hands up, right? How many of you is a 3, a 4, or a 5? Right in the middle, okay? I'm not going to ask the rest of you. 1s and 2s. Typically in the population, and this has been very stable going back to the early 1970s, a third of Americans say they're very happy, 6s and 7s. About 55%, between 50 and 60% will say they're somewhat happy, 3s and 4s and 5s. That was what most of you said. And the rest, 10 to 15%, will say not very happy, sort of the depressed minority. But that's a very stable finding. It doesn't matter who's president. It doesn't matter who has power. It doesn't matter very much what's going on with the economy after about 6 months, after a shock. It turns out that that's how people are generally feeling about their lives. Okay, so that's not even a very interesting question. Who's happy? The really interesting question that comes out of the literature is, what makes people happy? What explains happiness? And we know the answer to it. There are 3 things that explain human happiness: genetics, big life events, and choices. And I'm going to talk about all 3. Okay, so let's start with genetics. I don't want genetics to play any role in my happiness. And the reason is because I'm an American, right? And Americans are in control of everything. Right? This is how we were raised. I mean, the whole country was based on this idea that, you know what? I don't like it here. I'm getting on a boat. I'm going over there. I don't speak the language. I don't know anybody, but I don't care. I'm going to reinvent myself. It's the country of reinvention, right? So there is this culture that says, don't tell me something's wired, because I don't like it, right? But the facts are the facts. So let's go to the science. How much of your happiness is genetic? We know the answer. How? Well, there's a team of social psychologists at the University of Minnesota, a guy named David Lycan. Some of you may have heard of him. He's written wonderful papers, and his team had a database of twins, about 3,000 pairs of twins. And in this database of twins that were born between 1936 and 1955, there was a subgroup of, get this is amazing, identical twins that were separated at birth and adopted to separate families. Now, if you're a social scientist, this is like a dream come true. Because you can net out what's in their personalities as part of nature and what's part of nurture. They got them all back together at age 40 and did personality tests on them. Okay, now, I mean, it's almost like the government set this thing up. So, now, what did they find? They found, using the appropriate statistical methods, and those of you who are economists know what I'm talking about, and those of the rest of you who aren't, you don't care, so I'm not going to talk about it, but they found how much of each personality trait was actually genetic. How much of how religious you are is genetic? 40%. How much of how you vote is genetic? 40%. Extroversion, more than 50%. Neuroticism, more than 50%. Proclivity toward alcoholism, more than 50%. Proclivity toward criminality, more than 50%. And happiness. Baseline, basic happiness, 48%. Half of your happiness is genetic. Okay? Are you a dark and brooding person? Of course you are. You're on a college campus, right? And if you're a college professor, it means that's why you were drawn to this environment, right? And it's your parents' fault, right? Have you ever been around somebody who's just cheerful all the time? Have you ever worked with somebody like that? Very irritating, right? Why are they so much happier than you are? Why? They've got some secret, right? Got some secret. I've asked people, I remember asking people that. I used to play in the Barcelona Symphony. And there were it's a terrible job. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But it sounds good, but it wasn't. And I remember there were people around me, a couple that were super happy all the time and saying, what are they doing? What's their secret? And I was trying to find it. The secret was their DNA, right? If you're unhappy, I told this one to my wife, telling her about this research. She says, you know, it's true. Your mother did make you unhappy, literally. So if you're unhappy, it means you got lousy parents. That's just the way it is. It's just how you were wired, right? Bad luck. Okay, 48% is a little bit out of your control. Now, that's actually power for you, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. Because you have other parts that are under your control that you just need to start paying attention to and not worrying about that part is what it comes down to. But the big point is this. A lot of your happiness is actually innate. Now, the most obvious innate, although not genetic, characteristic that you see around people is their gender, right? So here's a question. According to the data, who's happier, men or women? Right? What do you think? I've heard women and I've heard men, so I know we've exhausted the possibilities at this point, right? Who's happier, men or women? The data are clear. Women. Women are happier than men. It's like the women are saying, yeah! It's like, it's nothing to celebrate, it is what it is, right? And are they a lot happier? The answer is yeah, they're a lot happier. Although the happiness gap has been decreasing over the decades. Not because men have been getting happier, but because women have been converging slowly to the average misery of men over the past few decades, since about 1960. Why? I'll leave that to you. Okay, so I've actually looked at this with respect to marital status. This is how I've studied this topic. So what you find is that married women are happier than married men. Single women are happier than single men. Widowed women are way happier than widowed men. Why are you laughing? What's the matter with you people? I told that one to my wife. She goes, huh, no kidding, right? And divorced women are unhappier than divorced men. It's the only group. So why? Turns out there's an explanation, and that explanation is typically when couples divorce and they have little kids, the kids go with mom, and it's very stressful to be a single mom working and taking care of kids, and that actually depresses happiness. So there's an outside explanation for that, okay? Now, women are happier than men, and when I was looking at the data on that, I found something that was probably the most interesting thing I've ever found about the subject of happiness, which is the average unhappiest age in a man's life, okay? Now, I saw this in a bunch of studies. They were showing there's an average unhappiest age. Now, it's only men. Women don't have it. So women might fluctuate more and from day to day, but from year to year, they're more stable than men too. Men have a big dip in their lives that's very easy to see in the data. And I've run the numbers myself, used the right analysis with the right tools, and I believe it, and I found it. So when do you think it is? When do you think the average unhappiest age in a man's life is? Okay? When do you think it is? Pretty good. That's right. 45. 45, okay? Now, those of you who are students, any of your dads 45? Maybe they were, maybe you remember it, right? 45, right? So how many guys in here are under 45, okay? Under 45. You're on your way down. So 45 is this midlife crisis, but you can see it in the data. So I went back to this psychologist buddy of mine, and I said, what's the deal? What's the deal? And he gave me a complicated explanation. Psychologists are very complicated. And he gave me a complicated explanation about dysfunction in family life and the blah, blah, blah. I didn't understand what he was talking about. I said, talk to me like I'm 4. I'm an economist. I need it clear, right? Give me the math. And he says, that's when your wife figures out definitively that you're boring. right? And I said, fine, fair enough, but I got to have more. So I went back to the data, and I found a better explanation, okay? There's a better explanation for it. It's not that everybody who's 45 is bummed out. Don't worry. It's that a sizable minority of men are really bummed out at 45, and they're pulling down the population average. You remember this from your stats, that you can have a population, and it can be driven by a subset of the population in one of its summary statistics. Right? And that's what's happening. A subset of guys is really depressed, and it makes everybody look like they come down a little, but they have come down a lot. So I really want to know what's going on with the sizable minority of men at age 45. What's bothering them so much? And you dig a little further, and you start looking at public opinion data and asking what's going on in their lives. Here's basically what you find. Okay, now, when you're a man, and you're in your 20s and 30s, and a woman too to a certain extent, but more traditionally this has been a phenomenon among men, life is simple. If you want to get ahead, and you want to be more prosperous, and you want to be more successful, and you want to be more happy, hit the gas. Hit the gas on your career. Get more promotions. Make more money. Find better jobs. Move. Just do it. Just hit it harder. Work more hours. And it actually works and works and works until it doesn't. And around age 45, a sizable minority, but a recognizable, pretty big minority of men, they look around and they say, I've been on this superhighway, just hitting the gas all these years, but it's the wrong road. I don't want to be here. I want to be someplace else, but I can't stop. You don't stop on a superhighway. I can't stop. I got the tuition payments for my kids, and I've got the mortgage, and it's killing me. I don't want to be a lawyer, but I can't stop. So what, okay, fine. Everybody's seen this phenomenon too, and it leads to really kind of bad and sort of funny things sometimes, but that's not the real question. The real question is, what do they want? Because if I figure that out, I'm going to give you the secret to happiness so that you don't have to fall into the trap. Okay, men or women. So what is it that they want? Metaphorically, and I'm going to explain this more later, it's this. They're on the wrong road. They don't want to be on the superhighway. They want to be on a little road that they discovered themselves. They want to be on that little dirt road over there with the guy in the motorcycle without the helmet. That's who they want to be. So, question, who is the guy on the motorcycle? Who is he, and what's he doing that looks so good to them? I know who the guy on the motorcycle is. That turns out to be me. And I'm going to tell you what that means. Okay, now, I accidentally found the right road. Pure accidentally found the right road. Here's how it went. When I was 19, I dropped out of college. Dropped out, kicked out, splitting hairs, okay? And I went on the road as a musician, because this is what my big dream was. I wanted to play the French horn, and it was great. I played chamber music all over the country. I drove through all the continental 48 states, and one time I drove straight through from Baltimore to San Francisco with 4 other guys. We didn't stop. That's what you do when you're 19, 20 years old. It seemed fun. It doesn't sound fun. It seemed fun at the time. I toured with a guy named Charlie Bird, who was a guitar player for a while, and then I wound up in the Barcelona Symphony. Now, great music. Great, I mean, the symphony orchestra, it's the greatest music ever written from my point of view, and I really loved it, but I saw my 45-year-old self when I was 28. All the guys around me were older than I was, and I was looking at them and something wasn't right. I mean, they were drinking too much, and they weren't having a good time in their marriage, and they were sort of depressed, and I'd ask them about their job and say, I don't like it, believe me, son, it gets old, right? And I thought to myself, I don't want to turn into that. So I hatched a plot. When I was 28 years old, I decided to go to college, go back to college and learn stuff. And so I called my dad. Now, my dad was a math professor at a little liberal arts college in Seattle. And so I thought he was going to think it was really cool that I was going to go back to college. I called him and I said, it's like long distance in those days, Barcelona to Seattle. I said, Dad, huge news. I'm going to quit music. He said, huh? I said, yeah, I'm going to go back to college and I'm going to study literature or math or political science or the harpsichord. I don't know. I'm going to use my brain. And he said, much to my surprise, he said, what are you talking about? You can't do that. You're married. You started a family. It's very irresponsible. You can't just quit. Why? And I said, because I'm not happy and I don't think I'm going to be happy. There's a long silence, long silence. And finally he says, what makes you so special? Right? And It turns out I was right, because now I'm doing what I love. Now I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. The weirdest thing is that my job is to stand here and talk to you about how you can live a happier life. It's completely crazy. This is what I love. But I happened onto it accidentally. I'm going to tell you how to not happen on it accidentally. Those of you who are guys under 45, but all of you. I'm going to tell what you need to do to find that. But you're going to have to wait 5 minutes or 10 minutes, because I've got some other things I need to tell you first. Okay? So hold that thought. 48% is genetic. Innate characteristics. Now, the second thing is big life events. Okay? Now, big life events is what you think makes you happy. These are the things that you're always, if only she'll marry me, I'll be happy. If only I graduate and I can find a job in this economy, then I'll be happy, right? If only I get into law school, then I'll be happy. If only I don't get sick, then I won't be unhappy. If only I don't have that bad accident, then I won't be unhappy. It's always big good things you're trying to get and big bad things that you're trying to avoid. We're very goal-oriented creatures. This is how we're wired. Question, how much of those big good and bad things is your happiness, is wired into your happiness? The answer is 40%. 40% actually comes from those big good and bad things. So, I mean, it's huge, right? So that's what you should be paying attention to all the time, is those great big things and avoiding those big bad things. That's wrong. That's wrong. It sounds like that's what you should be paying attention to, but it's not what you should be paying attention to. Why? Because number one, statistics show that we're not very good, as good as we think we are, at affecting those big things. Number two, they don't affect us the way we think they're going to. And number three, even if they're good, they don't last. Have you ever met somebody who moves to California? Yeah. Why do people move to California? For the taxes? No. Come on. Why do they move to California? They move to California because it's beautiful and sunny and cool and there's a breeze and people are gorgeous, right? That's why people move to California, right? How long does it elevate the average mood of the person who moves to California? We have the data. 6 months. 6 months. You turn your whole life upside down to move to California, and 6 months later you're just as bummed out as you were in New Orleans, right? No. As bummed out as you were in New Jersey. Sorry. So, and don't do it, basically. And everything is the same. Everything like that is the same. You buy that dream house. How long is it going to elevate your mood? Less than 6 months. Typically, I double your salary. How long is it going to help you? Cognitively, emotionally. 6 months, max. Everything's 6 months max. There's a great paper on this subject. It's an old paper now. It's from 1978. It's researchers at the University of Michigan did a paper that looked at two groups. Some of you may have heard about this classic study. The two groups were quadriplegics and lottery winners. Okay, now, what do quadriplegics and lottery winners have in common? We're going to close the door here. We're getting a beat going here. What do those two groups have in common? The answer is a complete punctuation to their equilibrium. Something rocks their world, for good or for ill, right? Here's the question. How long does it affect their happiness? First, the quadriplegics. Now, think about it. If you became a quadriplegic, you'd never be happy again, right? Wrong. 6 months after their accident, their happiness, on average, had risen almost all the way to what it was the day before they were hurt. Almost, not completely, but almost all the way up to their average happiness before they actually incurred their accident. Now, they said, to be fair, that they would do anything to be able to walk again, but happiness is not part of that. Happiness is something that is related to other things about our personality, other things about our lives. We've got to come to that in a minute. But it's an amazing finding how durable we are, how durable our emotions actually are, how stable we are, our psyches are, almost all the way up to where it was. Maybe more interesting are the lottery winners. If you hit the lottery, what would you do? This is the parlor game. You ever played this? You go to a party, you don't know anybody, you want to get a window into somebody's soul you don't know, you go around the room. If you hit the lottery, what would you do? Right? It's always the same things, good things. I'd move someplace where my family is nearby. I'd get the job I've always dreamed about, even if it doesn't pay anything, so I could help people. I would write that book I've always wanted to write. Or when you guys do this and you want to impress girls, you know what you say? You say, I'd start a foundation, right? No, you wouldn't. So So what really happens? Here's what people never say. Here's what people never say. If I hit the lottery, it'd be so awesome. I'd start by buying a bunch of junk I don't want and don't really need and doesn't give me any joy. Then I would start a romantic relationship with somebody who's using me and doesn't really love me. Oh, and then, best of all, I'd start a nasty alcoholic spiral, right? That's what happens. You've heard the story. It's terrible. You've heard the stories of these terrible cases. And the question is not whether or not that happens. The question is why. Why do people wipe out after they hit the lottery? We have tons of examples of this, anecdotally, and some actual empirical evidence that these big disasters occur. We know why this happens. This happens because, on their own, 6 months after people hit the lottery, they're at a slightly lower happiness level permanently than the day before they bought the ticket. Literally, now I don't know, probably none of you can relate to this. Most of you didn't buy a scratch-off on the way to this lecture. But there are big parts of the population that are buying lottery tickets all the time. Now, incidentally, this is a bad thing. I'm telling you, the evidence shows that people buy lottery tickets. Most don't win. Those who do are permanently unhappier. Right? The best thing that can happen to you if you buy a lottery ticket, literally, is that you don't win. So, who sells the lottery tickets? The government does. Louisiana's a lottery, right? That's called predation, especially on the poor. This is a great way to pump money out of poor people, leave them worse off, and give it to middle class and rich people. It's an incredible scheme. Why haven't people caught on? Well, because people like it, because they're cognitively driven to this idea, this acquisitive idea that if I just hit the lottery, it'll be great, and people demand it, right? Still, do you think people don't understand this? You do. We have an ethical dilemma on our hands here. Maybe more on that later if you want during the Q&A. But let's get back to why that is, that you're slightly unhappy or 6 months after you play. When in the surveys of people who had won the lottery, major Powerball lottery winners, typically poor, $30 million at least, just like this. That's how they were classified in this study. Here's what you find. Think about this weekend. What are you going to do that gives you a little bit of joy? Think about what you're going to do. Right now, think about what you're going to do this weekend that you're really looking forward to. Right? You're going to watch a ball game. You're going to hang out with your friends. You're going to go out for dinner and some drinks with some people that you love. Right? That's what makes you happy. That's what goes away when people have this big punctuation, this big explosion. Everything is dulled. It's like their circuits are blown out. They don't get joy from their hobbies. All their friends have changed. They don't like family life in the same way that they do. It's like nothing gives them flavor, and so they go in search of flavor. They go in search of full flavor in their lives, and what do they look for? They look for inappropriate consumption, inappropriate relationships, inappropriate use of drug and alcohol. And that's what we get because they're looking for the life in life 6 months or so after they finally hit the lottery. And this is where they end up, the stories that we actually hear. The truth is, if you want to be happy, don't go looking for the big things. Just don't go looking for the big things. Now, what I've told you is 48% is out of your control. 40% is kind of in your control, but it's a waste of your time. How much you got left? 12%. Here's the good news. It's all yours. The 12% is what's under your control. Now, should you think about it if it's only 12%? And the answer, and I actually contemplated this for a bunch of time. Should I even write about the subject of happiness if only 12% is under our direct control? And here's how I figured it out. So Jim and I, when we were at Georgia State University, we had this colleague, okay? And this colleague, he came home from the doctor once. He was the same age as me at the time. He was in his 30s in his time. And he came home from the doctor one day. And the doctor said, the doctor had told him he had something like 20 years left to live. Now, this is a weird thing to hear from the doctor. You go to the doctor, and the doctor says, I've been looking at your tests. Please come into my office. And you go, oh. And the doctor says, you have 6 months to live, or you're fine. But 20 years to live, what is that all about? It turned out he had a congenital heart defect that had no known, at that time, according to technology at the time, and still, it turns out, some 20 years later, 15 years later, that didn't have any remedy to it. So the result was that he would most likely die of a heart attack before the age of 60. Okay, now, what would you do if it turned out you thought you were going to have 40 years left of your life or 50 years left of your life, and you only have 20 years left of your life? That's like finding out you thought you can control all your happiness, you only have 12% of your happiness. What do you do? What do you do with the little bit you got left? More than you ever would have otherwise. So this is what our friend did. He said, you know what? I'm going to be a better dad and a better husband and a better community member and a better professor and a better scholar and a more happy person. I'm going to live my life to the fullest every single day. And he changed his life. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. He was so morose and so cynical all the time. And after that, you know, he went home and it literally says, honey, I want to have more kids. And she's like, you're not even going to be here, you know. But he would, but they did. They grew their family. He wanted to have more of experience with children. He said he would come home from work and say, we've never been to Istanbul. Get the kids, let's go. And they would just live spontaneously, and he was a happier person as a result of it. That's the same recipe for you and for me. You have 12%. Get it right. Figure out how to do that 12% exactly right, and start right after this lecture. Start using that 12% to the max. Now, here's the better news. The 12% I'm going to tell you about, the things you need to do and focus on, also are the parts of your life that will give you the best luck with the other 40%. Okay, because the 40%, you shouldn't be going for the big event. You should be living in such a way where your luck is best, and you're avoiding bad things and you're getting good things in the greatest probability. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of control over that too, if you do what I'm about to tell you with the 12%. You have a happiness portfolio. All you have to do is pay attention every single day to 4 things and neglect everything else. Okay? So put these 4 things on the top of your list, and then all the other things you're going to do, and then cross out everything but these 4. Okay? Now, here are the 4 things for you to pay attention to every single day. Your faith, your transcendental life, your interior life, your philosophy, your sense of ethics. You don't have to have a specific religious faith like I do, but just call it that. Your faith, your family, your community, and your work. Those are the big 4. Those are the big 4 sources that will give you control over the 12% happiness. Now, this is based on about 200 articles, scholarly articles and books that I've read so you don't have to. Right? And I guarantee you that these are the subjects that keep coming up again and again and again. Now, faith is self-explanatory. Family is self-explanatory. Maintaining the relationships that are most intimate to you, people who are in your family. Community requires a little bit more explanation. The 2 parts of community life are basically cultivating and maintaining friendships and giving. You got to give. You got to volunteer. Give your money away. Give your time, talent, and treasure away. Be a giving person. So friendships and giving, that's community. Okay? And I'm not going to talk about those 3 things, faith, family, and community, very much unless you want to talk about it in the Q&A. I want to talk about work, because the work is really the most paradoxical and the most interesting. Work as a source of happiness. Why? Why is work a source of happiness? Actually, to begin with, how could work be a source of happiness? It's drudgery. You read Dilbert cartoons or watch The Office or something, and you know that work's no fun. I mean, work is disutility, as economists call it, right? Well, answer this. What percentage of Americans either like or love their jobs? What percentage of Americans are either satisfied or very satisfied with their work? Okay? Get a number in your head. What do you think it is? 89%. I know, it's higher than you thought. 89% of Americans are either satisfied or very satisfied with their jobs. Now, does it matter if you have a college degree? No. Statistically insignificant. Does it matter if you're above or below average income? No. Does it matter if you're black or white? Does it matter if you're religious or secular? No, 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 no. Nothing matters. The same percentage in every demographic group likes or loves their job. Incredible finding. No other country's got this. France, 40%. Okay? 89% of the United States. The person who made your sandwich today loves her job. The guy who's going to bring your package tomorrow loves his job. The guy who's mowing a lawn when you go home tonight likes his job. Most likely, that's an amazing thing, right? Why? Why? Okay, is it because of money? Because that's where they get their money? Now, your mother told you, money doesn't buy happiness. Mom was right. Okay? Mom is always right. But mom had the data on her side in this case. Now, why? How do we know this? Well, there are a bunch of good studies. Believe it or not, economists have been duking this one out for 20 years. Does money buy happiness? Yes, no, in between, right? Basically what we find is this. All of the studies on money and happiness, you can boil them down to this. If you're truly poor, money buys happiness, right? You can increase happiness in somebody's life by relieving the pressures of poverty in poor countries and poor Americans alike. That's true. Now, that has big policy implications to me. Big policy. I'm a free enterprise guy. I run a free enterprise think tank. But I believe, based on this, that the safety net that actually redistributes resources to poor people is a really, really good thing, and we need to protect it. We actually need to fight for it, as a matter of fact, if we want people to live in a more prosperous society where people actually have a higher quality of life. But once you get above lower middle class, it levels off. Not completely, but pretty much. You can't buy almost any more happiness after lower middle class. And what that means is redistribution to people at lower middle class and middle class levels doesn't bring any more quality of life. And it becomes an exercise in futility, which also has policy connotations that we can discuss later as you understand. The bottom line is, in a country that's relatively prosperous and getting more prosperous, money is not the reason that work and happiness are so intimately intertwined. It's something else. So let's go looking through the data. You troll through the data, and you start looking at people and the sources of satisfaction in their lives. And then you start correlating them with the work that they're doing, and here's what you find. There's a phenomenon that explains happiness and work. It is what's going on with the guy on the motorcycle. It's what I found accidentally. It's what I'm experiencing at this exact moment. And it's called earned success. Earned success is the belief that you're creating value with your life and creating value in the lives of other people. Okay. If you believe that what you're doing is inherently valuable, that's matching your skills with your passions, and it's serving other people, we know that is the secret to your happiness. You need to find the thing where you are earning your success. Now, that doesn't mean money. That does not mean money. I did work for years. I wrote a textbook, you heard about it, a graduate MBA textbook that I don't recommend to you called Social Entrepreneurship. Okay? Now, when I was doing the work for that textbook, I talked to hundreds of social entrepreneurs. These are do-gooders. These are people who their profit margin is all about saving kids and feeding the hungry and making people literate and cleaning up the environment and helping their communities. That's how they get rich. That's the denomination of their great wealth. They are happy, just as happy as business entrepreneurs, as pecuniary entrepreneurs, because they feel they're earning their success. They're creating value with their lives and value in the lives of other people. That's our goal, is earned success, and that's why work matters so very much. Here's a question. What do we need, bless you, what do we need so that more people can have earned success? Because I'm going to make a value statement to you right now. I believe that earned success is such a big deal that it's my job to fight for a system where more people can have it. I want to live in a country, and I want to live in a world where more people earn their success. I don't care if they have money, where they can earn their success. That's my job, as far as I'm concerned. That's my moral duty. So how are we going to get it? And the answer is, you got to have a system. You got to have a system. What is that system? Well, first of all, think about this. Earned success is great for my happiness. But earned success is actually a life or death issue in other places in the world. Let me explain. When I was a kid, what was poverty? Let's go back all the way to when I was a little kid. Earliest memories, 1970. Okay? What was poverty in 1970? And the answer was, it was a picture in the National Geographic. It was a picture of a kid in sub-Saharan Africa with flies on his face and a distended belly, and there was nothing I could do about it, and there's nothing that you could do about it either. It was horrible. What do my kids think of about third world countries today, developing nations? 9% growth. Our jobs go in there. It's a different world. Now, there's too much poverty, and probably most of you feel morally commanded in joining me to help the least of these, our brothers and sisters, in some way, shape, or form. But it's a fundamentally different world. Fundamentally different. Here's an example. Between 1970 and today, the percentage of the world's population living on $1 a day or less. This is a standard definition of poverty, starvation level poverty by development economists. The percentage of the world's population living on $1 a day or less since 1970 has declined by 80%. An 80% decline. I bet you didn't know that. Nobody knows that. It doesn't show up in the paper. It's good news, right? We better have an explanation because that is literally the most important anti-poverty achievement in the history of mankind. The history of mankind. We've got to have an explanation. So what is it? Is it the United Nations? Is it U.S. foreign aid? Is it the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank? Good institutions, or bad, depending on your point of view, but is not that. No, 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 no. Here's what it is. According to development economists, according to the best research, it's 5 things. Some of it's controversial. Buckle your seatbelt. 5 things explain the 80% decline in the world's worst poverty. Globalization, free trade, property rights, rule of law, and entrepreneurship. It was the explosion of American-style free enterprise that started to occur after 1970 and spread all around the world. Were there costs? For sure. Of course there were costs. But that is the reason people have been lifted out of poverty. Talk to Chinese development economists, an extraordinary thing. Since 1980, 662 million mainland Chinese have been lifted out of starvation-level poverty in the mainland. Largely because of free trade and the capitalism that has reached into those economies. Now, I don't like everything about capitalism. You don't like everything about capitalism. But people are actually not starving today because of that. There's literally somebody in a sub-Saharan African village that you'll never see, you've never heard of, you'll never go there, you don't know anything about it, that is not going to die because of you. See, it's one thing to have charity. We all should give charitably. It's part of community. But you got to have something that works while you're sleeping. You got to have a system. And that's the beauty of it. We have a system. We have a system that has lifted billions of people out of poverty for the first time in human history. Now, back to your happiness. Earned success is the key. You need the system. What does the system look like? That'll make this for you. You can make it possible for you. And you can fight for so that it will be possible in other people's lives too. It's one that matches skills with passions. It's one where people celebrate hard work and personal responsibility. It's one where you get to keep the rewards of your hard work and personal responsibility and merit. It's one where when you succeed, things go well and you get to keep it. And when you don't, you actually feel some of the pain. So that you can update and you can improve. Now, not catastrophic failure, but failure that's discernible. The name of that system is what I just told you about that saved all these people in the world. It's the free enterprise system. Imperfect, to be sure. Failing in certain markets, to be sure. But think about what it's done for you. Think what it does for others. Think about the implications for happiness. Here are my last words, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Because I've talked about lots of stuff that I didn't explain, and my guess is you have some questions that you'd like more information on. Number one, here's my summary. Your happiness portfolio has 4 parts that you need to start paying attention to. Faith, family, community, work. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters for you to be the happiest person possible and take full control of that 12% and give yourself good luck in the other 40%. That's what you need to be thinking about. Okay, now, you're going to have that messed up. I guarantee you. What's the most common thing that people do to have an unbalanced happiness portfolio? What's the number one thing they do too much of, and what are the things that they neglect most? What do you do most? What are some of you people doing too much of? You're working too much, right? Oh, my faith is too heavy. No, that's not it. You're working too much, and you're neglecting. It's like, I love my mom too much. No, that's not it. No, it's people have a tendency to neglect faith, family, and friends, and they tend to work too hard. This is the key thing that even guys who understand this, they get to 45 and they're all burnt out. That's what's going on, typically. Since I've started doing this work, and I'll do speeches and things, I'll give a talk like this, and people will come up and tell me how unhappy they are. And it's a diagnostic tool. Tell me about your life, and I can tell you you do more of this and less of this, and more of this and less of this. Faith, family, community, and work. That's your portfolio. That's what you need to be paying attention to. Second, public policy. I don't know what your politics are. It doesn't matter, right? You can be left-wing or right-wing or a Democrat or Republican. The truth of the matter is, if you believe that people deserve to live in the greatest happiness possible and have the possibilities to lift themselves up to build their lives, if you join me in believing the nature of enterprise is not starting businesses, it's not for-profit activity, it's the enterprise of every single person's life. your enterprise is your life and you deserve to be able to build it, then you have to join me in fighting for the system that makes that possible. The system that makes possible earned success for the most people most of the time. Now, I know you're up for it. I know some of you will join me in the struggle because it really is a struggle. This is beyond politics. It's beyond all the nonsense that's going on in Washington, D.C. today. It's about how to give more people a better life and how to leave a better world. And if you do it, you're going to be happier, people around you are going to be happier, the world's going to be better off, and I'm going to even be happier too. So for that, God bless you and thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. Let me start first.
It's a 4-hour session, so. Yeah.
There's a literature out there in the behavioral economic psychology literature about how too much choice is a bad thing. Could be a bad thing. What's your thoughts on that, and how does it relate to happiness?
So there's a famous book called The Paradox of Choice. And the Paradox of Choice basically has all these experiments in it where people go into a supermarket and you have either 3 varieties of jam or 35 varieties of jam, right? Which are you going to enjoy more when you buy it? The answer is 3 varieties as opposed to 30 varieties, right? And then they ask people later and says, I don't know if I made the right choice if there were too many choices, right? There are a whole bunch of experiments like this. They did them mostly with college students at Stanford, and it's a really interesting book, but the conclusions were all wrong because the authors who wrote the book, their conclusion was choice isn't that great. Choice actually isn't good for people. What we need is a life that's more bereft of these types of choices. And so we could do a whole lot of good by tamping down competition in free markets. That's wrong. That's completely wrong. Here's the deal. The reason that choice is sometimes costly is because it comes with something that we think that economists call information and transaction costs. Okay? When you're making a choice, it's costly because you got to figure out which is which, and you have to decide which one to buy, and this results in certain costs. The answer to that, to transaction and information costs, is not to get rid of competition. Why? Because competition is so beneficial. The fact is, if there are 30 types of jam, you're going to have higher quality jam at lower prices and greater abundance all the time. You're going to have the Chilean jam, and you're going to have the Portuguese jam, and you're going to have the weird elderberry jam, all the stuff that you actually want. What it means, basically, is that we have to figure out how to navigate choice a little bit better than we typically do. I mean, it's simply up to us. So it's an imperfect conclusion to a very interesting set of experiments in that literature. Yes, sir. And then we'll go back to you, man.
I'm trying to complete my notes. You said globalization, free trade, property rights, rule of law, and
Entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship. Yep.
And you said there were the reasons that the big events don't last long, and they're not necessarily easy to control in terms of having a particular date. And there was a third.
The reason that big events are not you typically don't have the effect you think you're going to. We have. They don't last long. Actually, I broke one of them up into 2, so think of them as 2. They're hard to control. They're harder to control than you think. The outcomes are not what you think they're going to be typically when you invest in these things, and they never last. Yes, ma'am.
I work on Plato and Aristotle, so the questions you're asking have been with us since
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think, to me, maybe the deepest issue, and I just am not sure how you understand happiness has to do with the difference between, so the 4 things you mentioned at the end, family, community, work,
Right.
these are objective features and conditions of our lives
Right.
that someone can look at from the outside and see how well you're doing. You know, if you have a rich life in these regards or not. There's another layer, which is started with your statistics. The statistics are very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess it all. But how many people feel
Right.
good?
Right.
And it's just so remarkable sometimes the discrepancy one sees
Yeah.
between how people feel,
Right.
you know, especially maybe in non-normal cases like clinical depression or something.
Sure. Or drug addiction.
Drug addiction.
Yeah.
Right. So you can look at it from the outside and you go, wait, why are you unhappy? You
Right.
have a wonderful family.
Right.
You have great work. You have,
So you're Aristotelian, and that's Aristotelian happiness, eudaimonia, is a great thing because it basically says you can be eaten out inside by depression, but if you're living a good life well lived, axiomatically, you're happy in a way, right?
And, so there's controversy whether you should translate it happiness because we have such a subjective connotation with that term. But I'm kind of not sure what you're thinking or the way you're approaching it with the
So it was with
statistics you look at and everything.
Right.
How do you see the relation between those two things?
So that's a really great question, and I when usually in the first chapter of a book, that's the reason some of the books don't sell very well. It's because I'll spend a lot of time on measurement, right? Because this is, so I talked about the way that we're measuring in all the stuff that I'm talking about today. Is the surveys that say you have good things in your life, you have bad things in your life. All things considered, given this, how happy would you say you are about your life these days? That's a mix between good life well lived and psychological happiness at this moment. It's basically the best amalgam that we can find of that and it consistently will measure that particular phenomenon. Now, it's not robust philosophically. It just isn't. And the truth of the matter is the greatest discrepancy that you can find in measures of happiness are people who say, right now, how happy are you, right? And that has no bearing practically on how happy they truly are in an Aristotelian sense. That's the biggest problem. What we're trying to do is bring these things together. Psychological happiness and life satisfaction and moral goodness all kind of into one neat bundle. It's a very tough thing. I mean, philosophically, the unsoundness of it is troubling for sure, but that's what we're measuring.
And let me ask you one other thing. So in the kinds of policies that you would want to advocate or encourage, are you aiming to, I guess maybe it seems to me you can only aim to enhance these objective conditions. Or do you also think that you can do anything to address people's psychological
Well,
experience?
here's what, we know that measure that I was talking about can be enhanced through the happiness portfolio of faith, family, community, and work. People will experience the greatest life satisfaction as a result of those things, notwithstanding the fact that they'll still have the ups and downs. It doesn't blunt the ups and downs at all, the things that we're talking about. You know it because you have a family. Your family gives you more downs and more ups. Right? The psychological happiness moment to moment is not affected. But you will get a good effect along these lines. Now, how does it work? What's the mechanism through which it works? It's really interesting. If you talk to people who are really super religious, they'll say you're following natural law, you're following God's law. Right? You're being rewarded in a way. I mean, you're living in concert with what God wants. If you talk to people who are not religious at all, they'll give you other explanations for it. You're doing something that gives you a life that's morally well ordered. And so you're avoiding a lot of the bad experiences you would typically avoid. So there are different explanations along these lines. Now, the most interesting studies when we look at how we measure it, I mean, at the very beginning, nobody believed that these surveys would actually measure anything. My happiness, your happiness. And in truth, there are a bunch of studies out there that measure people in different countries. At some point, one of you will say, what about the fact that I read a study that said that, the Danes are the happiest people in the world, right? Because you always hear that, right? Never trust those studies. You can't trust those studies because they're not stable. I've seen studies that show that the Swedes are the happiest people in the world, some that show that the Brazilians are the happiest people in the world, some that show the Canadians are the happiest people in the world. And when you do empirical work, you can take a data set and torture it till it speaks to you, or you can take a whole bunch of different data sets that measure more or less the same thing in slightly different ways across different populations at different times and see if they converge. And when they start to converge, then you can be confident that you're finding something real. And that's the highly ethical way to start to do empirical research on a broad scale. So the point is, sure, different people experience it even in different ways. The most interesting studies actually show that Germanic languages have a tendency, so people in Sweden and Denmark and the United States, because English is a fundamentally Germanic language, and obviously Germany, they answer the questions really differently than people in Romance languages. Why? Because happiness in every Germanic language comes from the root word for luck. So in Middle English, the word for lucky was hap, H-A-P, which turned into happiness. Glücklich in German is lucky, happy. Glück is luck. What you find is it's felicitousness in the Romance languages. That sort of study is pretty interesting too. Whole other branch of studies have tried to baseline the surveys with physical studies. fMRI studies, you put people in the tubes and then look at what parts of their brain illuminate. There's one study that looks at how people smile. Okay, so it turns out there are 19 types of smiles. You didn't know that, did you? 19 types of smiles. Only one of them is associated with true happiness. Right, think about it. How happy do I look? All right? Not happy. That's because I'm not giving you a Duchenne smile, which is the only smile that employs the orbicularis oculi muscles right below your eyes. You want to know if somebody's truly happy when they're smiling? Don't look at the mouth. Look at the eyes. Right? You knew that. Look at the eyes, because and it's involuntary. You can't fake it. They say that some great actors can fake it. But those are the kinds of physical tests that they would use to try to baseline these things until they finally figured out that the surveys were accurate enough that they stopped going to the expensive tests as a result of it. But true enough, we don't have good survey methods to make this philosophically robust. So we just do the best we can. Good question. Let's see. We'll go over here and then we'll come back, okay? Unless nobody has anything. Is nobody ever here on anything? Okay, yeah.
So one of the big problems right now in changing the economy is unemployment.
Yeah.
There's a lot of long-term structural employment. So it seems like your argument's cut in different directions. So on the one hand, redistributedly, given this would be a low-income group
Yeah.
unemployed, so giving money to them while they're unemployed would make sense. On the other hand, you're also worried about them feeling a little bit of the pain of whatever bad decision they made to get unemployed to begin with.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile?
Yeah, it's great. Great question. Unemployment, okay, how does that play into it? And it's particularly a period right now. Okay, so earned success is what I was talking about, but it has an opposite, okay? And I didn't make up the opposite. It's called learned helplessness. Now, learned helplessness is a term that was invented by Martin Seligman, who's one of the most celebrated social psychologists who's done work on the subject of happiness. He teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. And Martin Seligman, when he was doing work starting in the late 1960s and early 70s, he was doing work on human subjects and even animals. And what he wanted to see was how they behaved when you would take away rewards that they had earned, or you gave them rewards that they didn't earn. It turns out they have the same sensation. They become passive, they become depressed, and they give up. He called that learned helplessness. Now, this is a very heavy thing. Think about it. You earn something, somebody takes it away. Or you didn't earn it and you keep getting it anyway. Same reaction. Learned helplessness. It's the opposite of earned success. You want a good society, a just society, a fair society, a happy society? Earn success. You want a depressed society? A society where people are unhappy, where people feel hopeless and helpless? Learned helplessness. That's how you do it. It's the perfect recipe for misery, it turns out. Now, how do you get that best? Lots of unemployment. If you want a society where people have the greatest sense of earned success and they avoid learned helplessness the most, you better be aggressive about creating jobs. You should never do something that dissuades people from working. You should never make it harder for companies to create jobs. Never, never do it, unless you never read the studies, unless you're such a materialist that you think that all that matters is the money. But who among us thinks that? Go to Washington, D.C., you'll find plenty of them. This is the bottom line.
Very low end, it does matter.
At the very low end, people who are chronically unemployed and are in misery, you can relieve a lot of the stress. The problem is typically with people who are chronically really poor, learned helplessness comes along with dependency. And so what we really need to do, the best public policies, actually I've been doing work on this. There's a new book that I'm working on right now. I'll tell you about it just in 2 seconds, okay? This is the first time I've ever talked about it, so bear with me. So when you read The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's great book that talked about the economy, how the economy works, 1776 it's written. The great thing about Adam Smith as an economist is he didn't do what Jim and I do, with writing equations on the board and running regressions and sitting in a darkened laboratory. No, no, no. He went to factories and looked what was going on. And in one famous passage in that book, he went to a pin factory to look at specialization and division of labor. And he compared one person making a pin with a whole bunch of people making lots of pins, and he showed that when you have division of labor and specialization, you get a lot more pins and it's a lot better. Okay, so I thought to myself when I was reading that, I'm doing my work wrong. I want to look at people who are miserable and poor, because I'm writing a book about poverty right now. I want to go to the pin factory. So I've been working with these guys that I'm going on these site visits to the poorest people, the most vulnerable people I've ever met. These are places that politicians don't go. Felons, prostitutes, drug dealers, people who are actually, the difference is that they're not at their depths of desperation and vulnerability. They're building their lives to come back. Okay, so when I'm there, here's the question I ask. What do you need? What do you need? There's one thing for us at a university to say, here's what poor people need, right? And this leads in sort of the think tank world to say, the little girl living with her mother in a car, and you go and say, sweetheart, you know what you need to do? You need to start a small business. Idiotic. right? Idiotic, right? So you say to poor people, people who are really vulnerable, what do you need? The answer is always the same. And in social science speak, in scholar speak, here's what it is. In this order: spiritual transformation, relief, and opportunity. They all say the same. It's got to start with spiritual transformation. If you start with relief, it goes in a bad direction because it's basically pouring money in some place where money can't be used appropriately because of moral conditions. Now, I didn't make it up. I didn't go in there and say, I tell you what, you need to find God. No. What do you need? Then relief. If you don't have relief, if somebody needs to pay the rent, they need relief. And that's where it's so good to have a social safety net, paid for even by the government and charity, that will actually provide this relief. And then you got to have opportunity. You can't let the safety net turn into a hammock. You got to have an opportunity society that's ruthless about providing great education to everybody, and an entrepreneurial system that will reach all the way down to the bottom. So your policy portfolio is culture that will allow spiritual transformation, that has relief from charity and a government social safety net that's very robust, that's very serious. And then you have to have opportunity that largely comes from education and entrepreneurship. And with those things, the sky's really the limit. So that's how it basically relates together. And if I do my job in 2015, a new book will come out and I'll send you a copy. Thanks. Over here, this side, we got to give this side some affirmative action. Then we'll come back here. Yeah.
I have a pair of questions you can answer, that one for sure, or both. The first is, to what extent do you think that government decision-making should be guided by considerations of happiness, even if it's omission, right? So, of course, you might think, well, it's got to do that real often. But nevertheless, should they have this in mind at all when they're deciding to do or not do something?
Yeah.
That's the first question. The second is, this thing I've heard over and over again in terms of summaries of the self-satisfaction report literature. And this is something I have not read for fans, it's just been an echo
Yeah.
was that the biggest predictor was people's how they compared to their, or how they thought they compared to their peers, which of course would bear an awful lot of questions of redistribution, even beyond those critical levels.
So the first one was?
The first one was, to what extent should we be
Yeah.
refraining from
Yeah, should be a policy objective. My view is that, generally speaking, this falls into the wrong hands and it gets into really weird policies fast when we talk about happiness per se. If we're trying to give people the right emotional state, it's something that the government is inherently poor at doing. Earned success and learned helplessness, on the other hand, are really, really important policy goals, in my view, because you want to find the drivers of life satisfaction that are most proximate to happiness, and at the same time where the government can be competent at dealing with them. The government is incompetent at dealing with it. You don't want to, I mean, the French government is now actually has a bureau of happiness. I mean, really? And they're all really super bummed out. So it's just not working out so great, right? On the other hand, to talk about what the conditions are of earned success, which is proximate to happiness, and where we have drivers under the control of government and learned helplessness, and it has real policy implications, we can be dealing with things like that. So that's my view. The second was?
The second was report accurate over and over.
Oh, right, that relative income. So there are a bunch of studies that show that people care an awful lot where they sit in the distribution. Okay, they care about it a lot. So they're a lot poorer than their neighbors. They're not going to like that. That's true. That's absolutely true. Now, the trouble with that is that you can, if you follow that basic logic as opposed to giving people pathways to their success, you're going to always go and you squash downward, and that leads to outcomes that people in the end don't like at all. Okay, that actually leads to greater unhappiness. And number one. Number two is there are very good studies out of the United States and the UK that show that when people honestly believe that they have pathways to rise, they like inequality. They like inequality. You know, when you think about it, economic inequality is something that we're always worried about, but inequality per se is something we all like. We like inequality. We like to be our own person. We don't want to live in a hive. We don't want to live like bees, where every single person has the same conditions, where every person goes through the same education with the same major and the same level of college and the same kind of job, and no matter how hard they work or what their preferences for labor and leisure are, they're the same pay. Nobody wants that. Not one of you wants that. It's a very radical type of thing to want. We like inequality. What we don't want is inequality that's unfair. Fairness is the key thing. If you believe that the inequality comes about because of things that have nothing to do with your merit, you're going to be very unhappy about that. That's the reason that the key to this, to squaring the circle on these policy implications, is if you join me in believing that inequality within boundaries of standard of living that is acceptable is great, you also have to join me in being ruthless about opportunity policy. You have to be a warrior for education. You have to be looking for policies where people will always create good private sector jobs so that people can earn their success. Because if they don't have the mobility, then inequality is lousy because it's unfair. And we'll be living in a society that has this fundamentally immoral strain to it. Here's what worries me. Here's what keeps me up at night as a free enterprise economist. Mobility, economic mobility in America, according to Boston Federal Reserve data, the ability to move from the bottom quintile to the middle quintile or above, that ability has fallen by 1/3 since 1980. Income mobility is falling in America today. That is it's a real crime. It's actually a scandal, because then where do we go? We say, okay, I'm not going to do anything about that, and our economy is not doing anything about that. That's gotten worse over the past 5 years, worse. So what do we talk about instead? The scandal of income inequality and how we're trying to get rid of income inequality. Forget that. Go to the root problem, which is mobility. And if we attack that, the other one takes care of itself, and people live better, more interesting, more exciting lives. That's my view. It's a very good question. Back here, yes, sir.
If you're a student looking to join an organization and work for them and be happy, or you're a manager responsible for motivating and being happy, I've read some articles that say 3 things. Mastery, that you want to feel like you're world-class, you want to be competitive on a world-class.
Right.
Autonomy, and then a purpose that is beyond yourself. And you agree with those 3 things as if you're a student looking to find an organization to join, ask what you're going to get from that organization in those 3 areas.
Yeah. So serve others, be good, and be in control. It's basically, you want to be great at something and distinguish yourself. You can really earn your success.
Mastery.
You want to create value with your life, mastery, and you want to create value in the lives of others, that's service, and you want to be in control. And you want to be in control. That's exactly right. I mean, in essence, these are the components of earned success, is what we're talking about. That's absolutely the case, and some of it is what we need to look for, and some of it is what we need to cultivate within ourselves. Right now, the paradox of service is the hardest one of all. There's a tendency, the acquisitive nature that we have makes it seem like if we serve others more, there's less for us. The truth of the matter is serving other people more leaves more for you. Lots of studies on this, lots of studies. You want to be healthier, happier, and richer? Start giving away your money, giving away your time, giving away your energy, giving away your affection. Lots of studies on this. I wrote a whole book on this in 2006. It consumed me utterly, was this particular topic. So service is really paradoxical in this way. And this is one of the great things that we can do, faculty that we can do, is to talk about this. You know, forced service projects, I don't know. Maybe they're good, maybe they're bad. But actually talking about these empirical regularities. This is one of the keys. We're good at helping people to become masters. We're good at letting people have control. We're bad at teaching people to be servants of others, servants of other people. This is a great study, a 2006 study from the University of Kent, 2 social psychologists. It's great. I mean, they were doing a game. It's one of the Jim has done lots of these games where you're using human subjects and you're doing experiments. And it's a typical experiment where you bring everybody into a room. So we're all sitting in the room here, and I pass $10 out to every single person in the room, and I put a coffee can in the middle and say, decide how much of your money you want to put in the can. Okay? And then at the end, I'm going to look in there and I'm going to count it up, I'm going to double it, and I'm going to pass it out equally in front of the whole group. Right? Now, what's the optimal strategy? It's for you all to put all your money in the can, I double it, and everybody gets 100% more, right? But what are you going to do if you're really crafty? You're going to help everybody else as a sucker, because you're going to keep your money, everybody else puts in theirs, you get 200% more effectively, right? So what happens from this? When you do these experiments, you find that people give some people give a lot. It depends on kind of the character of the person. Women give more than men, and et cetera. You find all these kind of interesting demographic things. But this study in 2006 had a second phase. And in the second, I write about this study, incidentally, in the LA Times tomorrow morning, if you're interested in looking at this particular study. So, and in this second phase of the study, they broke up into small groups, and they elected leaders. And they didn't know each other at all. They elected leaders for another task. 80% of the time, the leaders elected in phase 2 were the biggest givers in phase 1. This is servant leadership. It's an empirical truth. People observe your service, and what they discern is your leadership. It's a really big deal. This shows you how to lead a better life, is to be a public servant. Not public servant in the case of you got to go work for the government, but to truly serve others in both private and public ways. Yes, sir.
So, you were giving, by the way, thank you for coming. It was nice talking. It was such a great motivational speaker until you got ideological.
That's right. You thought I was going to do like Dianetics on you or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Join me, man. You'll be happy the whole time. That's right.
You know what? Here's what I noticed that you have joined me. I'm a Rawlsian liberal.
Yeah.
I don't care about these big entitlements for the middle class.
Yeah.
I care about the poor.
Yeah, man.
I was shocked to find the head of the AEI saying that you want to raise this, you want to give a really strong safety net and a whole lot of money towards education.
You got to read our stuff more.
So I guess so in any case, you are a Rawlsian liberal, even though you probably don't like that. But the fact
I have no opinion on it. Anyway, go ahead.
Good.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So in the United States right now, we have these gigantic entitlement programs.
Yeah.
I don't care about Paul Ryan's little revisions and stuff. Both parties are so committed to them. We got the sequester, and right now it's doing all these things to hurt the poor. We aren't. The problem, I would take it for you and for me, is the big entitlement programs, which are for the middle class.
Yeah.
How do you change that since the parties are elected and controlled by the middle class?
So you and I agree 100%. You agree? You should be working at AEI because you're a conservative like me, and so here's the deal.
Yeah, she's been telling me that.
That's right. Are you married? That's right. Oh, okay. And she's like, no way. Are you kidding? Anyway, so
She's the last department chair.
okay. So look. The way to win this, look, let's just assume that what's making America insolvent is runaway entitlement programs, which are disproportionately paying out more money than people ever paid into them. This is math, okay? This is math, right? So this is uncontroversial so far, okay? What gets controversial is what you do about it, right? The answer of saying, we can't afford it, doesn't work. Doesn't work. People don't care. People will say, I don't care. Somebody else will pay for it. We're the rich country. We'll raise taxes on the rich. If you're a liberal, you say, we'll raise taxes on the rich. If you're a conservative, you say, at some point, I don't want to offend old people because they tend to vote Republican, and so at some point somebody will take care of this and we'll kick the can down the road, right? The only answer is a moral revolution. The only answer is a moral revolution. What is the moral case for entitlement reform? It goes something like this. So I lived in Barcelona for a bunch of years. And the great thing about living in Barcelona, one of the cool things, I had moved there from New York City, right? Barcelona, no homelessness. When I was there in the 80s and 90s, no homelessness. Today, I go back and my house has a homeless guy living on the stoop. What happened? It didn't become a right-wing, Ayn Randian, Galt's Gulch kind of place. No. What happened was the debt crisis. That's what happened. What happened was effectively entitlements got out of control. They cratered the economy, which became insolvent, which led to austerity, and austerity always hurts the poor. As sure as we're all here today, austerity in America and every other country in history doesn't hurt the rich. It barely touches the middle class. It kills the poor. Literally, in poor countries, literally kills the poor. This is an empirical regularity. Count on it. Okay, if you join me in feeling a special preference for the poor, you must declare war on the entitlement crisis for the middle class. It is the moral solution. It's what we have to do. Because if you pour the money out the door, America is going to become insolvent at some point. It's going to be, we're going to have austerity imposed on our economy, and there is no economy in history that says, okay, we got no money left, so the tiny little bit I've got, I'm going to give it to poor people. Never going to happen. We have to solve the problem now to help the poor now, and that's the ultimate moral case that we have to make to the American people. And how do we get it? The answer is moral leadership, which we don't have in Washington, D.C., in either party, in any branch of government. That's what I would say. My guess is I haven't said anything too objectionable in your point of view.
The problem morally is we promised to mess with people. We really did. We took their money. that is all the Social Security and
Yeah.
Medicare things. And we promised them something. So there is a little bit of a moral dilemma there.
Well, if I retire today and I'm middle class, Medicare will pay me 3 times what I paid into it. That's not the promise. Nobody promised to pay me 3 times what I paid into it. The truth of the matter is you have to change the overt contract without changing the moral promise. And the only way that you do that, incidentally, is by bringing the American people along to take care of the least of these in our population. The only way that you do it is to say, do you believe that we have to take care of the poorest people in our country? That's it. What ultimately any politician from either party has to do, because then the moral contract stays intact even if the public policy contract has been altered. That happens all the time, and it's a completely legitimate thing to do because it was a stupid public policy contract that was insolvent the day it was signed. Exactly right. It didn't work unless people keep dying at 66 forever, which is how the whole system was put together, basically.
Maybe one more question.
We got time for one more question.
So, as a follow-up on Professor Brower's question, the kind of the ideal, or I'm sorry, not the ideal, stereotypical redistribution program in America today is, many people would say, the Affordable Care Act. In the 26 states which haven't accepted Medicare expansion, 60% of the uninsured are working people. So they're people who make over the 137% federal poverty line cap on Medicare or Medicaid, but typically below 200% FPL.
Right.
So
FPL.
Federal poverty.
I know. It's just no acronyms. It's illegal. Okay.
These, I think, are people that
Except AEI.
neither you nor
Right.
I would consider to be the poorest of the poor.
Right.
Who've got jobs.
Right.
And where do they fit in your sort of system? Are these people who are deserving and needing of some sort of redistributive aid, or are these people who really, you have to say, bite the bullet and get the short end of the stick?
Well, the working poor in this country have always been the one that don't have medical care. The truth is we have socialized medicine in America, and we have for a very long time. It's called Medicaid. That's for the bottom 20% of the income distribution. It's the second 20% that are almost all working that have gone without. Like when I was in my 20s and I didn't have health care, I was in the second 20% of the income distribution. Actually, I was in the bottom, but I was working. So the working poor have always had this particular problem. That is really the only problem in healthcare coverage in America today. The key thing is, what are you going to do to cover that exact group? A 2,000-page bill that covers absolutely everything with the most arcane set of rules that literally nobody can understand? So if you're for it, you understand 10%. If you're against it, you understand 9%. And basically, it's a proxy war between whether or not you like Democrats or Republicans. That's what we got going on. The states largely that are repudiating it for right now are saying we want a system that takes care of those particular people that are in the most need. I mean, that's what I want them to be thinking. I mean, look, everybody's all over the place on this. And we don't understand it well enough to implement it right now in the first place. So that's what the argument should be about. Look, if you're for it, for the right reasons, that's great. If you're against it for the right reasons, that should be okay too. But right now, it's nothing more than a proxy war, and the people who are getting lost are those exact people who need the help the most. Look, you go on our website, aei.org, you can find a 7-point plan that'll take care of those people. That's a free market healthcare reform plan. We've got it solved. We know how to solve it. Now, why are we in this mess, you might ask? The answer is because in 2004 and 2005 and 2006, when Republicans controlled all of Washington, D.C., and everybody knew we needed health care reform, they didn't do anything. And they didn't do anything, which means it came to a head, and then the Democrats took over everything, and they pushed through the kind of health care reform they want, which is ultimately a single-payer system for this whole country. And that's the direction that we're going. So we have this weird proxy battle, and the only people who are really not being served are the people who are in the most need. That's classic. We always marginalize the people who are in the most need unless we have a strong moral sense of what we're trying to do and make that moral case very, very acutely. And when we do that, incidentally, you and I come together in about 95% of the time, and that's when we're lethal. So with that lethality, my last words again are thank you, and we're going to go have a reception and drink wine. Thanks. Thank you.